Hello, Internet people. I'm gonna quickly introduce myself and then get into the topic of this video. My name is Clark Macbeth, and I live in Maple Grove, Minnesota. I have been wanting to start fresh on YouTube for a while now, so this will be my new channel. The channel with my actual name on it. Now, when it comes to YouTube, they say the best way to have a YouTube channel is to be consistent. My previous YouTube channel was anything but. So this channel is going to be on one topic, and that topic is going to be Minnesota. It is the topic that I am willing to talk your ears out about and show to you. Minnesota is the topic I'm willing to put effort into making these videos and engaging with. It is the topic that I'm willing to make edits for and, just put the effort into being a YouTuber for, and something I'm willing to do in my spare time. And I also have this perfect spot for making vlogs with, so why waste it? So without any further ado, let's discuss something political. The one political constant of Minnesota. Now, I fully understand that in these polarizing times, it's been hard to find political constants about anything, anywhere. But in Minnesota, there is one consistent thing that you can count on happening regardless of who is in charge. I am, of course, referring to the constant building and maintenance of nature trails. Whether you are in an urban or rural area, there is some political dynamic that leads to nature trails being built and maintained. Let's start with rural areas. The reason that nature trails are built and maintained in rural areas is because it attracts tourism from other states and from the Twin Cities. The nature trails are a reason to explore the more natural parts of the state. That is why these nature trails are built with almost no objection from rural lawmakers and local officials, and in fact, they will often aid in the building of trails for bikes and pedestrians. Speaking of biking and cycling in general, let's switch gears and discuss why the cities are putting so much funding into trails and bike lanes and all that good stuff. Bike lanes and nature trails not only make the city look beautiful, it also has the potential to reduce traffic congestion and air pollution. Minneapolis is consistently ranked as the most bike-friendly city in the United States. Link in the description. Of course, I'm going to have a citation, but this is my first YouTube video. You can forgive me if it doesn't look perfect. But whether you are in a major city like Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you're in a suburb, there is a mix of these two lines of logic. They attract tourists and they can reduce traffic congestion and air pollution. And of course, if you're in a rural area, more tourism. We have more people coming from out of state, as well as from the urban areas in the state, exploring nature in Minnesota. And that is always a plus. This political dynamic makes Minnesota a very good state to live in, at least during the summer, if you are a cyclist. There is so much cycling and pedestrian infrastructure in Minnesota that a lot of states on the coasts, and particularly in the South, do not have. If you want to ride your bike from Minneapolis to Duluth, you can do that in 14 hours. It is possible. It is a possibility. It is something that you can do. And you can do that a lot safer than you can from Miami to Orlando. Of course, going from Minneapolis to Duluth is an extreme example. Something I want to try sometime after this COVID-19 stuff is done. So in order to get to Duluth on bike, all you have to do is go along bike paths to Interstate 35, to a path along Interstate 35, I should say. You can't ride your bike on the interstate, which is a good thing, but there are bike paths along Interstate 35, and you do have to go through a few small towns, but there is enough infrastructure in place to where you can spend a whole day cycling from Minneapolis to Duluth. A lot of states do not have this. Going back to Florida, if you want to cycle from Miami to Orlando, it is a complicated mess. You need to do a lot more research than finding paths along highways and going through a few small towns. If you want to cycle from Miami to Orlando, what you got to do is you got to find a safe path out of Miami somehow, then ride along the side of Florida. You can't go the more direct route. You have to go along the side of Florida because that's where most of the cycling infrastructure is, along beaches, along boardwalks, that sort of thing. And then you have to go back into Central Florida and make your way into Orlando and somehow make it to where you want to go in Orlando safely. In Minnesota, it's simple, really. You just got to find a safe path along a highway and take that path. And if you have to go through Minneapolis, cycling through Minneapolis is really, really easy. There is a bike path or bike lane just about anywhere in Minneapolis and St. Paul and in much of the metro region. And if you want to include St. Cloud, it's relatively safe to cycle in St. Cloud as well. And St. Cloud is a really conservative area, but even they get the fact that if you have trails, if you have bike trails and walking paths, that's safer for everyone in general, and also it will attract tourists to St. Cloud. And I have lived in Savannah, and I lived in a neighborhood where this was the 90s, so things might have changed a little bit. But in Savannah, I lived in a neighborhood where you can cycle relatively safely within the neighborhood I lived in. But if you wanted to cycle to the grocery store, you are stuck with a road with no bike lane. And a lot of the southern infrastructure has roads with no bike lanes, especially when you're out of the city center. And that's because building and maintaining trails is not a political constant in the South. The tourist areas have more trails and bike lanes. But in Minnesota, it is a political constant because, you have the cities, a more progressive leaning area that wants to get cars off the road. And then you have rural areas that every rural area in the state is at least somewhat pretty. And there are people who want to see that. So bike trails, nature trails, they're built, they're maintained. And whether you are a liberal politician or a conservative politician, the general consensus is going to be that these trails are beneficial. Now, the constituents are not as unified on the building and maintaining of trails. And as in the Minneapolis metropolitan area, there are certainly drivers that are annoyed about how many cyclists there are on the road, and the rules are not completely consistent. In Maple Grove, as far as I know, where I live, you can use the trail alongside the major roads to cycle and be a pedestrian. But in Minneapolis, you cannot use the sidewalk along the major roads. You have to use a bike lane, or you have to try your luck on a road. But that's relatively rare because there is on all the major roads there is a bike lane, and even where there isn't, there's usually a park you can use to fill in the gaps, which is why Minneapolis is so cyclist and pedestrian friendly. So you have Minnesota, where the building and maintaining of trails for cyclists and pedestrian is a political constant. You will find support for it everywhere. And then there is the South, where it is kind of a hot button issue. There is a consensus that, a general consensus that in touristy areas, those are okay, those are fine, but once you go outside of those, the infrastructure stops. It just stops. And the suburbs of the South, it's just not safe to be a pedestrian or cyclist. But then you have the coasts. They are somewhat in the middle of all of that. In the Northeast, they initially built things for cyclists in mind because those are older areas. But then they built a bunch of infrastructure for cars, and then they had to build bike lanes and paths on top of that. And on the West Coast, there is some of the political dynamic of Minnesota, where you have rural areas. People want tourists and hikers and bikers and they want people to explore. There are certainly pretty places to explore, and then you have the cities. Washington is like that. Oregon is somewhat like that, but California is more of a mixed bag. The state is basically compelling. The Sacramento is basically compelling California to add the infrastructure that is needed, but depending on what region of California you are in, the support for trails for cyclists and pedestrians can be, very enthusiastic, especially in the urban areas and in rural areas that have a lot of nature, but in the Central Valley, that is not so much the case. So there is that for California. But in Minnesota, there's a lot of nature throughout the state, and Minneapolis, St. Paul, the suburbs, Duluth, they either want to attract tourists and or reduce their carbon footprints. Get cars off the road, reduce traffic congestion, and cycling is a good way to do that. And this political constant of Minnesota is somewhat consistent throughout the upper Midwest. Regardless of who is in charge, there is the need among politicians to build and maintain these trails because of the tourism aspect, especially, and to a lesser extent, reduce congestions in the cities themselves. But what makes me feel the need to discuss this about Minnesota especially is, Minneapolis and St. Paul and Duluth are very bike-friendly cities. Even the suburbs are very bike-friendly compared to the South. And in the rest of the upper Midwest, it's not as good, but again, is a lot better than the southern United States. The political constant of Minnesota is unique to Minnesota in that there are urban, suburban, and rural areas in Minnesota. In Wyoming, you pretty much have towns, and the spaces between them. Wyoming is very cyclist friendly, but that is only to attract tourists. Wyoming really doesn't care about the environment. The constituents don't. They only care enough about the environment to have enough of the environment to attract tourists. In Minnesota, there is certainly a dynamic here. You have the urban areas that want to reduce traffic congestion and air pollution. And, we didn't build our roads in Minneapolis and St. Paul, or even Duluth, as well as they did in Kansas City. So congestion is a problem here. If you go to a rural area, it's just like Wyoming. This attracts tourists, and if we neglect that, we are letting the tourists down. They won't want to come here anymore. And if we don't have well-maintained bike trails and infrastructure, and if we don't clean up the trash by the lakes, they're not going to want to come here anymore. Our economy will collapse. So it's just a good thing to have this infrastructure. And that's what makes it so constant here in Minnesota. And, there are some things that are not as consistent and constant in Minnesota that you can, there are more controversial things. This is my first video. I wanted to address a constant that you can expect in Minnesota, and I would personally encourage people to ride bikes or walk on the trails, because you'll see a lot more beauty in the state if you do that. And that's it for this video. In the next video, I'm going to talk about something a bit more controversial, and I am going to be open-minded about it. I'm just going to state my observations with that. So that is the political constant of Minnesota. And if you liked this video, I encourage you to leave a like and subscribe. And, thank you. Thank you for watching and giving this channel a chance.